Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being with us this afternoon as we continue our new series of discussions called Conversations for an Equitable South, where we will dig deeply into how individuals play a role in creating, sustaining, and ultimately changing racist attitudes and actions. Today, we'll have part two of our conversations focused on the role white women have to play in upholding or dismantling structural racism in our communities. As we explore this topic, it's important that we take a look back, though, at our country's history and understand the role that white women have historically played during critical moments. There is a dominant narrative in our society that white women have often been just passive bystanders throughout our history, sidelined and kept from power by white men, or otherwise consumed with domestic responsibilities. Our panel of experts today will challenge those beliefs, as each of their bodies of work show that white women have played an active role in building and sustaining structural racism and white supremacy throughout history and today. We have lots of ground to cover, so let's just get started. I'm happy to welcome our panelists. Stephanie Jones-Rogers is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of They Were Her Property, that examines the deep economic ties that white women in the South had to an American institution of slavery in the 19th century. Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae is the Creighton Sossaman Professor of History at Western Carolina University, the co-director of the Appalachian Oral History Project, and the author of Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy. Her book explores the work white women led to maintain white supremacy in the South and across the nation during the Jim Crow era of the 1920s to 1970s. And finally, Seyward Darby is a journalist, editor-in-chief of Atavist magazine, and the author of Sisters in Hate, that follows the stories of three white women of the alt-right to understand the role white women play today in propagating racist extremism and white nationalist movements. And our conversation will be moderated today by my fellow New Orleanian, Erin Greenwald, Vice President of Public Programs and Editor-in-Chief of 64 parishes at the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities. Thank you all so much for joining us again today. Now, Erin, I'm going to toss it to you.
Great. Thanks, Mitch. Thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. And I want to make sure to thank E Pluribus Unum and Mitch Landrew and his staff for making the program possible. We have a lot of ground to cover this afternoon, so let's jump in. The first question is for all of you. You've each used your work to take a critical look at the role of white women in upholding white supremacy and oppression during different time periods in American history. Can each of you take a minute or two to share a bit about how you came to that topic and what inspired you to write your books?
What order would you like us to go in?
Any order you'd like. Seyward, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, great. I led myself right into that one. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. And I will say that, one of the reasons I got into my work was reading these two scholars' work. I was interested in the role that women played in the so-called alt-right leading up to Trump's election and then in its immediate aftermath. And I was interested in the fact that women were never mentioned as being part of that. They were never quoted. It was as though they didn't exist. And there seemed to be a sort of public assumption that women wouldn't want to be involved in such a misogynistic and racist space, which, as historical research shows, is not true. And so I just started following dozens of women and their online presences and reading as much as I could about, the history of women's complicity in upholding white supremacy and perpetuating white nationalism. And the thing that I was most, frankly, horrified by were the connections and echoes over time. How little has really changed. Maybe the methods of disseminating information, certain language may have shifted, but really roles are so similar to the way that they've always been. So that was, I started researching this about 4.5 years ago. So here we are.
Well, let's continue back in time on this trajectory and we'll go to Elizabeth.
I think for me, it was an initial question and a nagging doubt. And the question was pretty simple. It maybe seems naive at this point, but why had the US been unable to meet its promise of racial equality? Like over the centuries, why had that been? And the doubt I had was, that was it really or solely elected officials, largely male, even the most demagogic of them, right? Alabama's George Wallace or Mississippi's Ross Barnett and their forerunners and progeny, that were they enough to maintain white supremacist politics and racial inequality? And I think I thought of my upbringing, right? And if there was a male minister in the pulpit, but you wanted to get something done, you went to the back of the church and you asked the church ladies, right? And so I wondered if that wasn't also what was going on. So where was racial segregation and school segregation and white supremacist politics maintained and reproduced, and who was doing the work? And when I went to the archives, I found white women, and I found them everywhere, and there's more than the ones I found. Just eventually had to stop. But they were doing this sort of daily work to secure and sustain a social order that kept white over black for generations.
So
And Stephanie,
yeah,
you
of
go all the way
course.
back.
So my interest started right in New Orleans, in fact. So I kind of bring us all together, Mitch and you and myself, with a woman who many New Orleanians probably know very well, Marie Delphine Lalaurie. And so I became really fascinated by her story, not necessarily the kind of her sadism, but I was really interested in her role and her status as a slave-owning woman. Not only a slave-owning woman, but a slave-owning woman who was married and who basically exercised complete control over the enslaved people in her power. And I was really interested in finding out whether she was alone, whether she was, part of a community of women who exercised certain rights, exercised similar rights. And so I kind of, circulated, my initial research on Marie in a course I was taking in graduate school. And one of my classmates said, great, you found this one woman who exercises all this power that, is this sadist, but how many other women are like her? How many other women are in her community? And so this book was really my attempt to answer my classmates' question. I didn't get quite to the numbers question, but I was able to kind of realize in this book that there was indeed a community of slave-owning women who Marie, and Marie was a part of that community. So that's really where the kind of genesis of the book began, right in graduate school and right in New Orleans with Marie Delphine Lalaurie.
Well, I've really enjoyed watching your work kind of unfold over the past few years, Stephanie, and I think we'll stay with you. Your book unpacks the extensive economic ties that white women had to the institution of slavery in American history, particularly in the century before the Civil War. Can you share a story or two from your book that captured what that economic power looked like at the time?
Sure. So I have two favorites from the book that I share in the book. One is right after the American Revolution with a woman named Anne Robertson. She was a married woman who decided that she was going to take her chances on speculation, very much like people flip houses, in New Orleans right after Katrina, and here in California, they flip houses. So they buy them cheap and they fix them up and then they sell them high. So she decided she was going to do the same thing, but with enslaved people. So she would buy enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina, usually very unwell, very ill, typically off, local slave ships that had just come in. And she would nurse them back to health, not in a maternal way, but really with her eye towards the market. And then she would flip them. She would sell them for much more than she had actually paid for them. And she did all this while being married, while her husband fussed at her and told her, she needed to be very careful with, the decisions she was making in the market, and she would ignore him. And so when she died, her estate included 27 enslaved men, women, and children. And the second example that I really love, found interesting, was a case involving a woman named Annie Poor. And Annie Poor, she had a number of enslaved people that she owned. She would train them in particular skills. So carpentry, being a blacksmith, a seamstress, and then she would sell them on an auction block that she set up right in her backyard. So she would have auctions on her own estate, and people would come from all around and bid upon the enslaved people that she owned. And so those are two ways that I think really events the ways in which white slave-owning women were deeply invested in the economy of American slavery and brought that wealth back to their households.
Thank you. Elizabeth, so much of your work focuses on the everyday actions of what you might consider ordinary white women who work to advance segregationist policies, particularly as educators and storytellers in our communities. Can you share a bit more about the motivations of these white women in the Jim Crow era, and give us an example or two of how they acted, as you put it, as segregation's constant gardeners?
I mean, the motivations question's a little hard. I mean, I think it's self-interest, right? It's economic interest, it's social power, it's political power, right? That motivated these white women, and they believed that their interests, particularly the ones that were the producers, to borrow from sort of Ibram Kendi's work, the producers of this white supremacist politics, right? They believed that their sort of status and wealth and was secured by white supremacist politics. And but they also realized it took really hard work. I had a student today ask me, it's like, why did you spend so long writing about such boring like PTA meetings? And I was like, well, I didn't think they were that boring, but I guess if you put it that way. But I think there was a tension in the Jim Crow era. Like one of the sort of truths of segregation was that it was natural. Yet you have this legion of white women working all the time to make sure that the next generation heard stories and narratives that secured racial segregation and white supremacy. And so that sort of lie, right, was at the center of their work. And they worked in schools and they told stories, right, among other things, in public welfare and eugenics and drawing the color line, right? They were always sort of crafting a narrative that upheld white supremacist politics and made it really pliable for the next, whatever the next era would be. And there's two stories I'll sort of share. With stories being central and with the control of the historical narrative being central to white supremacist politics, the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1920s played a really central role in censoring and controlling textbooks. And what they did, right, and this is, the South was not the leader in education in a lot of ways, but they were the leader in education in terms of moving to statewide textbook selection, right, and adoption. And the economic calculus, if you were a publishing house, was clear, right? If you get Texas or Louisiana or North Carolina to purchase your textbook, right, then you're making a lot more money than you would if you have to go county by county. And so these white women, many of them UDC members, realized this early on. And they lobbied state textbook selection committees. They wrote pieces in the newspaper that said, don't adopt, don't let your children be taught by a textbook that says, that calls it the Civil War, it's the war between the states. And slavery is not an economic exploitative institution, it was a school, and it should be referred to this way. And if you think about sort of the litany of some of the things people say about the past, and it comes out of this moment. And so this textbook selection committee, which is kind of wonky, right? And nobody paid attention to, let white women affect the very few people that then affected the textbooks of the nation, because national publishing houses are going to do what was most profitable. And so the kids in California were reading the same books as the kids in Mississippi, calling it the war between the states, saying that slavery was a school, etc. So that's one example. The other is a kind of more amorphous example. So there's a woman named Nell Battle Lewis, who was renowned as kind of a liberal, radical supporter of labor rights and communist in the 1920s, and she wrote for the Raleigh News and Observer. But when you read her columns, she covered in sort of, to build up her sort of liberal and progressive reputation, she covered a lot of performances by African-American students at many of the Black colleges that were in North Carolina. But the way she wrote about them told a story that was also sort of the cultural production of white supremacy. So she would say, and wrote about a Black musical performance, that when they performed spirituals and work songs, they were extraordinary, right? When they performed Shakespeare, right, they were acting in an adopted language. And so in this way, sort of it doesn't seem subtle today at all, but by covering the achievements of Black college students in North Carolina, she also reified that there was a particular place, right? And the place for African Americans in white Southern society was in work songs and spirituals, right? Not in the intellectual work of Shakespeare as chemist. And so I think that sort of contentment or that projection of sort of where people fit in society was also really critical sort of Jim Crow storytelling.
Yeah, I think the kind of intergenerational indoctrination that takes place through the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and then later, later on in other organizations that might seem quite innocuous to us today, like the PTA or garden clubs, those have had, I think, wider impact than we might sometimes recognize. As you say, economy of scale, when Texas adopts a textbook and California decides to adopt a textbook, often other people will adopt it as well because of the economies of scale. And that hasn't actually changed. That has continued to be a problem. And I think it's a good way for us to kind of segue into Seyward's work. Seyward, your book focuses on the role that white women play in modern day white nationalist organizations. What have you found that attracts white women to these movements today? What are they getting out of it?
Yeah, well, each person is getting something different out of it. It's self-interest that is drawing people to these spaces. And the things that women are looking for are really not so different than what men who get involved are looking for. They are looking for a sense of purpose, belonging, having a voice, feeling like they're part of something bigger than themselves, but also they want to keep what they have or get more. There's a sense of something is being lost, something is being taken, things are changing, the world is uncertain, and I need to secure the things that I am entitled to. And this space, the far right, is a space that promises that is possible. And I think too, there's this interesting confluence of the ideology of the far right with the digital moment in which we find ourselves. And a lot of these women, especially, some of the women who I feature prominently in my book, are frankly white nationalist influencers. And that's such an odd way to put it, but it's true. They have these big followings on social media. Some of them are making money off of that. They have Etsy stores and Pinterest pages and, other ways of connecting with these communities of women. And I think that there's this sort of affirming effect that happens when you post a YouTube video or something on Instagram about, how you're so proud of the white race, and how you want to have as many white babies as possible and things like that. And you get hundreds of likes, or people send you DMs and say, oh, that's awesome, me too. I think there's this affirming thing that happens. And the more affirmation you get, the more you're going to double down on it. And I think too, it's so interesting to hear, and I love Mothers of Massive Resistance. It's so good. And it's so interesting to hear about the ways in which women's work has been considered so much less important in a political sense. Politics and what we think of as politically material activity has been defined by white men for the most part. So that the act of being a mom, that the act of being able to share stories about the way that, politics and society should be, that is political. You are doing politics. No, you're not necessarily in the halls of power, but you are actively doing something political. And I think that women today who get drawn into the far right are interested in something similar. This feeling of, well, I want to be, an attractive woman on social media. I want to be a mom. I want to be a wife. I want to be, but I also want to be, successful in this way or that way. And this movement allows them to feel like I can do all of those things. And I'm actually going to be congratulated on it, because motherhood and femininity and all of these, sort of traditional retrograde ways of thinking about women are not only celebrated on the far right, it's actually, kind of couched as this high calling and this political purpose that will, you know, not only save you, but save your families and your people. And I think that that can be very intoxicating to some women. And I was going to share, I was trying to think of the right story to share because there are so many, but I wanted to share one that I feel everybody knows what happened in Charlottesville, right? Everybody knows about Heather Heyer's murder. Everybody knows about the guys with tiki torches. I feel like very few people know that there was a woman behind the scenes organizing all of it. She was the person on social media, Discord at that point was the sort of platform of choice for communicating about the event. And she was the one pointing people in certain directions. Oh, you need to figure out carpooling, go to this page. Oh, you need to you know, figure out what to do with your kids, go to this page. Oh, you're wondering what to, you know, what kind of signs to paint, go to this page. She was the logistical behind the scenes person, as so often women are, you know, across society. But she's not really a part of the narrative because she was not one of the people on camera. She was deposed after the fact, and, you know, very much people in law enforcement became aware of what her role had been. But, you know, it's the kind of thing you could argue that it wouldn't have even come together without that work. And yet that's kind of minimized in comparison to, well, who's CNN interviewing, you know, which man of the day with a, you know, greased over hair. Like it's sexism in some ways like blinds us to the contributions of women.
Do you see linkages between the modern white supremacist movements and earlier efforts to uphold white supremacy, particularly as it relates to women?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, this was when I started researching this topic, you know, I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic. I don't have something that I've, you know, invested my entire life in studying. And I really was scratching the surface thinking I'll write a little bit about, you know, these women and the role that they're playing today and why nobody's talking about it. And then what I found is the deeper I dug, going back in time, you know, there was the work of Kathleen Blee at the University of Pittsburgh, who was looking at women in hate groups in the 80s and 90s. You had Professor McRae's work, and then all the way back to, you know, Stephanie's incredible book. And it was like, oh, wait, these things are just iterations or variations on a theme. And it was really remarkable how consistent these ideas were over time of preserving whiteness and the feminine role in that, and where women should, you know, were told to exercise their power, but then the places where, for instance, you know, in terms of slaveholding, you know, deeply immersed in what was the mainstream economy of the South at the time. But again, we after the fact tend to look back on these periods, and for sexist reasons and other reasons, we assume, oh, well, women were just, you know, cosseted, and, you know, they couldn't possibly have been involved. And what I was really struck by was the ways in which the next generations of women who were involved in these spaces used that to their advantage. They were given cover, and they learned from, you know, the ways in which, you know, women got away with ways in, you know, which they were complicit. And so it's almost like this domino effect up to the present moment.
So I want to ask all of you guys to address something that comes up in all three of your books. You all confront this idea that white women have been powerless or absent during major political movements in American history. And you challenge those notions by showing the dangerous ways that some white women have contributed to upholding our country's system of racial oppression. This is something that came up in the first EPU conversation as well, that you know, the truth is that women are far more powerful than our society often recognizes or acknowledges. But why do you think this idea of white women being marginal or somehow outside of mainstream efforts to maintain white supremacy continues to be the dominant narrative? And also, what are the consequences of that?
So I I would like to jump in and address that, or try to address that. You know, I've been asked this question so often, particularly in the context of academia, particularly in the context of historical scholarship. And so I've reflected upon this and thought about this a lot. And, you know, one of the conclusions that I've drawn is that, you know, so much of what historians have done, so much of what we do as a society is to focus on gender oppression. We focus on white women's oppression under patriarchy, the adverse impact that patriarchy has had upon white women's lives, but we do so at the expense of deeply investigating the ways in which they benefit from whiteness, the ways in which they benefit from white privilege and exercise a certain kind of power that their whiteness affords to them. And so the consequences of that, and I think we see kind of iterations of that, as Seyward has said, iterations of that same kind of theme throughout all of our books. And I think, you know, the consequences of that is that in this moment, that continues to happen. I think, you know, when people look at the insurrection at the Capitol, there, you know, often, you know, you see themes of motherhood, you see themes of, you know, victimhood over, you know, the ways in which these women's actions are really supporting and upholding and actually contributing to the development of a new iteration of white supremacy. And so I think we lose that context when we don't think about that, you know, long historical arc and that kind of the multiple manifestations of this tendency to, as I said, privilege, you know, kind of deep examination and investigation of patriarchal oppression and gender oppression over white women's lives and in white women's lives at the expense of really understanding how whiteness affords them a particular kind of power that they have routinely not been able to possess in other aspects of their lives.
Yeah, and I think as a result of that, to build on Professor Jones-Rogers' comments, is that white progressive women have sort of been the people that were initially studied, right? So if you looked at the civil rights movement, it's the Anne Braden and the Virginia Durr and the Jessie Daniel Ames, it's the white women that we're fighting against. But the majority of the story, right, was not white women who were fighting against racial oppression. It's the white women that were supporting white supremacist politics. And that's how massive resistance came to be massive, right? Is that there was this group of, the people bucking against the system are not the majority, right? And so I think that in the academy, the people that moved into those roles to study this first, right, looked back to people that had done some of the things they did. And what we missed was the story of the majority, I think, who, as Stephanie said, right, used whiteness in a way to guarantee their power and privilege and status. And I think it's also wrapped up in a real kind of gender essentialism. And I know that there's a question about this later, but that's something, I think back to the question of, well, was that woman really the only woman slaveholder? Is this notion, right, that motherhood, the ability to bear children, evoke some sort of nurturing social justice kind of ethos. And that was a strategy of suffragists. That wasn't a reality, right? But yet it has become, right, this notion that motherhood as this construct, right, has allowed, so that the soccer mom or the PTA member who's propagating white supremacist politics is not as important as George Wallace, right? Or not as important as the people committing racist violence. And I think that balance really needs to be reshifted. And I think that, and that there's a sort of notion that women's biology, even among the most sort of progressive people, has dictated a kind of political consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so, right, if you don't have this expansive sense of, like, you know, social justice, and you're like, you're not a good, you're not a real woman. And I think we see that in questions about sisterhood and all, like this notion, right, that real women have this bond that rises out of this oppression that negates this notion of how powerful whiteness performs in American society.
Yeah, I'm like a bobblehead doll while you guys are talking, by the way. For the best that the camera is not on all four of us at the same time. But no, I mean, I completely agree with everything that was just said. And I think, you know, again, to kind of tie it back to the last thing I said before, you know, the ways in which women use this as cover. They know it. I've heard them say that they know it, you know, on these white nationalist YouTube channels or on these message boards. You know, there's a woman in my book, Lana Locktuff, who runs a white nationalist outlet of sorts called Red Ice. And she's literally said women can get away with saying hard things because they're soft. I'm paraphrasing like what her actual quote is, but they're aware of the ways in which femininity and having, you know, a certain female cast on something can make it seem more palatable, less odious. And I think too, you know, I thought a lot about, since the insurrection, you know, this question of violence versus, you know, the upholding of white supremacy in ways that, you know, are violent, but are not violent in this way that involves, you know, necessarily guns and bombs and trying to take over, you know, the capital of our country. And I think that, you know, this is where media, as a member of the media have played a role in elevating stories that are about really catastrophic stuff. And also perpetuating this idea of lone wolves, which nobody, you know, in the media seems to know what to do with the Capitol story, because we're so used to, when we do hear about right-wing terrorists, you know, to hear about it from the standpoint of, oh, well, he was, you know, a troubled person who was operating alone. But as Kathleen Belew, who has wrote this fantastic book, Bring the War Home, has pointed out, there really are no lone wolves. You know, they're all connected to ecosystems of disinformation, of radical ideas. And oftentimes women are doing a lot of the work of, you know, helping those systems stay in place. So a good example of this is to talk about Lana Locktuff again. After the shooting at the mosque in New Zealand, there was a researcher, and I can't remember their name and I feel terrible about that, but there was a researcher who did this big data dive and looked at the rhetoric in the shooter's manifesto and compared it to the rhetoric of a large number of right-wing pundits around the world. And Lana was so high. It was like a DNA match, right? Where you like, you know, line the things up. And she's not a person who has committed violence. She's not a person who necessarily actively, you know, says go do violence. That's kind of against her brand, frankly. But she's part of an ecosystem where these ideas can prompt people to take violent action. And so I think, you know, it's incumbent, not to fast forward to solutions, but it really is incumbent upon people who are telling stories about this moment in which we find ourselves and the people who are actors in this moment to look beyond what might be the most shocking thing and look deeper and deeper at systems and ideas that are, you know, allowing that to happen or nurturing it. And women, again, that's often where you're going to find women. Oh, I think you're muted.
There were voices outside, so I muted myself. Stephanie, your book touches briefly on the rise of lost cause narratives following the abolition of slavery and the attempts by white women to defend, minimize, or erase their roles, not only in maintaining slavery, but in the active enslavement, buying, and selling of men, women, and children. Can you share a bit more about those efforts and their impacts?
Absolutely. So I was really fascinated by the work of historians and scholars like Karen Cox, who've looked at, you know, the really fundamental roles that white women, white Southern women in particular, played after the Civil War in memorializing the Confederacy, whether that took the shape of statues, or, you know, naming and renaming schools throughout the South. But I was really interested in how these same women and their descendants, how they conceptualized white women's economic investments in the institution in lost cause literature. So in memoirs, in biographies, in autobiographies, how did they talk about white women's investments in the economy of American slavery? And so I thought it was fascinating that they not only did they remove any mention of women's kind of economic role, so they erased or scrubbed clean any kind of deep investment, whether it be the buying, the selling, with hiring, so any economic dimension whatsoever to their roles, the roles that they played in the economy of American slavery and American enslavement more broadly. But also they talked about slavery in the ways that, I think, both Seyward as well as Elizabeth have already referred to, as a positive good, as an institution that was bestowed upon them, whether they liked it or not, that they inherited enslaved people, but that buying and selling human beings was off limits, that crossed the line and that they never crossed the line. But what was equally, really equally fascinating to me, and I think is really relevant to our conversation today, is that they began to articulate, or they really kind of very powerfully articulated the kind of rhetoric that we see, kind of racist and white supremacist rhetoric that we see take shape and take hold in the 20th century that kind of led to lynching. So they talked about, the bestiality and animalistic characteristics of African descended people, that slavery was a system within which a regime within which those desires that would typically be associated with animalistic creatures and bestial creatures could be tamed, could be controlled, and without it, then you see what happens after the war. So they erase that economic dimension to their roles in slavery, but they propagated a very a kind of virulent racism and white supremacist ideology in those memoirs and in those biographies and autobiographies. And what I also think, the last thing that I thought was really fascinating about these books and these texts is that they often talked about who their audience happened to be. So their audience was not simply the white reader, the white audience member that might buy the book, but it was also their grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren. They would often, dedicate these books and open those books with introductions, talking directly to those descendants. So they wanted them to have a very particular idea of slavery and the system and the regime and the role that white women played in it. And they basically erase the economic role. So that was something that I really thought was wonderful to kind of tie up the book with, and think it very much connects to both of these wonderful books that connect, I think join, really create this arc, this historical arc that does in fact show how these things tie together. This particular part of the story definitely ties, I think, very neatly with Elizabeth's book and the story that she tells there as well.
As we move away from the Trump presidency and deal with the consequences of an incredibly divided electorate, and as our country continues to navigate the racial reckoning that reignited in mid-2020 in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd, how can each of your books help us understand where we are now as a country? Seyward or Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in here?
Well, I think Seyward and Stephanie have already sort of pointed to this, but I think as long as we continue to construct white supremacist politics as masculine, and focus on these sort of publicly violent episodes, which I'm not saying are not important, they are important, but as long as that remains this sort of dominant constructed narrative, then we are ill-equipped to fight, right? And to develop a political strategy that recognizes that there's deep schisms, right? Between white women, between white and Black women, and that much of what we know comes out of not paying attention, right? To some other voices. If we had paid attention to, and some people have, but sort of collectively, to the WPA narratives that Stephanie uses, to Anne Moody's autobiography, we would understand that white women were playing really vital roles in white supremacist politics. And I think until we expand our vision to understand that the soccer mom or the PTA president or the garden club is whatever the head of the garden club is, right, is as sort of critical to maintaining white supremacy, then we're not going to be able to sort of dislodge it in the places where it thrives.
Yeah, I'll quickly tag on to that to say, you know, one of the things I thought was important when I was working on my book was to show that the gap between mainstream white, more conservative, but also liberal white Americans in some cases, and white nationalists is not that big. That in fact, white nationalists are not an other. They're not some, you know, I mean, they are the fringe, like, I guess in a sort of, you know, literal sense, but in terms of, you know, what is the actual spectrum, but the things that they espouse, what they say, what they, you know, the way in which they want the world to be, what they want to maintain is actually not so different than what a lot of mainstream white America would like. And so the way I described it in my book is like a funhouse mirror, that the far right is what a lot of white America would see if they looked in a funhouse mirror. It's like, well, this is really distorted, but it is quite familiar. And I think that, you know, one thing that's so important in this moment, I think, is to not assume, if you're a white American, that that doesn't have anything to do with you, that it somehow is no reflection of you. And it is, frankly. And not only that, it is a reflection of institutions that maybe you are benefiting from, that people you love are benefiting from. And so really grappling with that familiarity, and, you know, calling a spade when you see it. So use another, I don't know, is the head of a gardening club like the chief skater? That's what I'm gonna say now. But you know, I think that's such an important step, to not assume that this has nothing to do with you, has nothing to do with your community, just because you don't know somebody who's a neo-Nazi. Because, you know, the path from kind of mainstream conservative, has some libertarian ideas, you know, isn't so sure about this or that, you know, from a factual standpoint, to sliding into something much more extreme is actually it happens much more quickly, and it happens in far easier a fashion than we like to admit to ourselves. So so I hope that my book helps people see that familiarity and start, you know, grappling with it.
Stephanie, any final thoughts before we move into audience Q&A?
I just usually say that when we ignore white women's roles in white supremacy and propagating white supremacist ideas, it's like a sick body and only trying to heal half of it. We need to try to heal the whole body, and so we need to focus on white women's actions as well as white men's actions. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. So we're going to move to a handful of questions that we've received online through audience Q&A in advance of today's session. And I'm going to start with a question that came in about other groups that might have participated in the construction and maintenance of white supremacy. As you investigated white women's work in their constructing and maintaining white supremacy, did you discover other groups whose participation had also been overlooked?
Well, you know, I think it depends on how you want to define groups, because, you know, I certainly was time and again stunned by media complicity, for instance.
That's a great example.
Yeah, you know, even places, I mean, certainly there are places that elevated overt white supremacist voices, sometimes in the name of diversity and diversity of opinion and whatnot, which is, you know, really just a lie, because it's just a perpetuation of white power in a different form. But then also just media not really getting it, like not really covering things very well, buying into, especially in the later part of the 20th century into the 21st century, you know, buying into this idea that we are a post-racial society, we've come through the worst of it, and kind of congratulating ourselves. And then certainly in the post 9/11 period, you know, this fixation on radical Islamist terrorism, to the detriment of thinking about any other possible, you know, threat to our security. And I mean that from a law enforcement standpoint, but also just from a societal fabric standpoint. And so, yeah, I think, you know, the media is definitely one group, if you will, over time that I think has been problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think here in New Orleans, our mainstream paper, the Times Picayune, in the 1990s, issued an apology for decades-long coverage that was very clearly biased against particularly Black people in the city. That's definitely something that we are not alone in New Orleans in facing. Here's another question. How do we begin to move past years of hurt and mistrust to a future of support, compassion, and genuine sisterhood as women?
Right. I think that work is, it's a ways off, because I think what's been clear through our conversation today is that we're still in the throes of white supremacist, violence, all kinds of things. And white women are deeply invested in the perpetuation of white supremacy. And we have to stop that first. We have to resolve that matter first before we can really get to the work of alliances that are fruitful and productive alliances. And I think these kind of conversations, the one we had today, the ones that are going on, in this space, are the beginning of that kind of work. But I think we're a ways off before we have a ways to go before we can get to a place where that is possible. That's what I really honestly think, about that question.
What do you think about the role of denial in the kind of unwillingness to recognize that there is an issue? Seyward, you are dealing with, in many instances, you said that the funhouse mirror, it's kind of the maybe most extreme portion or manifestation of white women engaging in white supremacy. But what about for the many, many white women who can't possibly see themselves as being involved or complicit, but who are? How do we help people get out of their denial?
Oof. Well, I think first you have to recognize, right, that just if you haven't actively produced white supremacist politics, you have consumed it, right? I mean, the sort of Jim Crow South and Jim Crow Nation and all the sort of institutions involved in that meant that you could not have sort of come of age having escaped some level of influence of that. And so I think that, for the people that are producing those politics, I don't think sisterhood is really where it's at, right? I just like, I think that model, I can't even get my head around that. I think the more productive alliances are people that begin to realize, right, that are educated and understand how they have been complicit in a system, and that then the work is required to sort of undo that complicity, right? And whether that's in how you function in your school system, or how you work in your community, or who you lobby for, or how you work. I mean, I think there's so many places to do that. But I think sisterhood seems like a hard model for me at this point. And maybe, as Stephanie said, it's just way down the road. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, one thing I think about a lot is that so often when we talk about racial justice in the United States, we put the burden of getting to that point on the people who are already the victims of injustice, and the, communities and individuals who, have suffered for, centuries in some cases. And I think, in this moment, if you are a white woman and you encounter a white woman saying, I mean, certainly there's the extreme stuff, but even stuff that's like, well, that sounds a lot like the extreme, just a little, toned down, but still really problematic. What do you mean when you say, you want to move out of the neighborhood because you don't think the schools are good enough, or, what do you mean? And I think like having these conversations, and it's hard because you're going to be uncomfortable. But I think, one thing I have tried in my own life, not just in my research, but, in just conversations with people, is asking questions. Well, why? Like, why do you think that? Or, what do you think makes you feel that way? As opposed to, you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, because that often doesn't go anywhere. But that conversation is incumbent upon me. Like, I do not think that, people, again, who are people who have been victimized by these systems, like it should not be on their shoulders to call a spade every time. And so to keep using my gardening reference. So I think that that's one thing, is, you know, really, especially white women, white men too, but just given the conversation here, you know, white women, you know, really doing some of the hard work of having hard conversations and calling out what they see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank all three of you for having an open and honest conversation with us today. Seyward Darby, Stephanie Jones-Rogers, and Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mitch Landrieu.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Stephanie, Elizabeth, and Seyward, for this incredible conversation. I really appreciate your insights and your knowledge. You've all given us quite a bit to think about, and I know we've only skimmed the surface. We have a lot more to talk about. I'd encourage anyone watching today to pick up your books to learn more. And I thank you again for your work. And also I want to thank our staff, Lauren Richards and Maddie McLean, and Sarah Robertson Miller, Scott Hutchinson, and the EPU staff for putting this incredible event together. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today for this important discussion. We look forward to seeing you next time.